historical place as the world's #1 economies. Now, this is a paper which was released by Angus Maddison, and he's from the OECD Development Centre. And obviously, he is a historical economist, so he examines economies over time. And he put together this time series that looks at the share of world GDP since year zero. And what we find is that basically for most of the modern economic period, so from year zero, China and India have in fact dominated the global economy. They accounted for about 66% of the global economy share up until the 1800s. Then we had the Industrial Revolution, which occurred starting in Western Europe. And basically what that meant was that it was no longer population that was the sole driver of your economic growth. It was the productivity of your population. And as we saw the specialization of labor, as we saw the introduction of industrialization to economic production, we saw those economies with smaller populations start to take a greater economic share. Western Europe became the largest economic region in the world for a brief period over time, for 1 century, around 1850 to 1950. And then, of course, we had the arrival with an enormous bang of the United States economy. But what we're seeing now as a result of globalization, as a result of companies moving their production platforms to China, to India, they're training their workforces, there's a process of technology transfer and skills transfer occurring. You really are seeing an equalization of the qualifications and the education of the workforce globally. That's been one of the key benefits of globalization. And as you see that, one of the dynamics you're seeing is that population is once again returning as perhaps the dominant driver of economic growth and economic share. So what we expect to see over the next 50 years, and it's common to most people's forecasts, is that China and India will indeed regain their historical mantle as the world's largest economies. Now, another point to focus on, and this one's a little bit near term, is what's going to happen with Chinese economic growth in 2010 and 2011. Obviously in response to the stresses that we're now starting to see coming through from Europe and also coming through from financial risk contagion surrounding the events that we're seeing in Europe. And I think the first point we need to note is that what we're seeing at the moment is a sovereign risk event. Investors are being very selective when they look at economies. They're looking at their debt to GDP ratios. Asia went through its enormous deleveraging in 1997 and 1998. We saw debt to GDP ratios fall dramatically in the public and private sector. And it was a function of the very onerous bailout packages put on Asia as a result of the IMF or the Asia crisis. The protest we're seeing in Greece at the moment protest against the severity of those measures, which the IMF is proposing. Of course, Asia went through this a decade ago. The measures were so austere, Asia has never rebuilt its debt levels to the levels we saw prior to the crisis. So in terms of the risk of a sovereign debt event in Asia, it does appear to be rather low. The other point to note is many people look at China and they're of the view, okay, China saved itself over the course of 2009, is clearly easing back on the stimulus. What we're seeing in China, however, is a multi-year stimulus package was put in place. And again, this comes back to the point, in 2008, China made the policy decision that external demand was going to be impaired in the developed economies for several years. And as a result of that, they spent the equivalent of export share of GDP to basically boost the economy. And we still hear people talking about the China 4 trillion yuan stimulus package that was announced in November 2008. Of course, the total size of stimulus has well exceeded that. We've seen massive amounts of bank lending to finance infrastructure projects such as the expansion of the railway system, the building of new airports, nuclear stations, irrigation programs, and the PBOC, in their quarterly monetary policy report released a few days ago, put out an estimate that the size of bank lending, or the amount of funds required to complete projects which had already been approved, is an additional 42 trillion yuan. So we saw 9.5 trillion of bank lending in 2009. The estimates are that we need to see 42 trillion yuan of lending to complete all the projects that were approved over the 13 months from November 2008 to December 2009. Now, obviously, we're not going to see that much spending in the economy, but we've made an estimate that you'll see around 50% of that spending. Premier Wen Jiabao was quite adamant at the National People's Congress earlier this year that bank lending would be allowed to continue to complete projects which had been approved. If you look back at China in the 1990s, from 93 to 94, bank lending was very suddenly cut off for projects, and the result was you had a dramatic rise in the non-performing loan problem. By 1995, 50% of loans in China had gone non-performing. So in an effort to avoid that policy mistake, what we're seeing is a commitment to allow bank lending to continue to run. And if you look at the type of projects China has been putting in place, sure, there has been some leakage into the property sector, but if you're lending 3 or 4 years for a railway or for an airport, and you cut off lending when you've only built half the railway track, that immediately becomes a non-viable project or a non-performing loan. So it's in China's systemic interest and the stability of the financial system that a good part of this lending is actually respected. So we've estimated 50% implementation of this lending, and that will give you a total stimulus package over 3 or 4 years of about 18 to 20 trillion US dollars. So if we put that into context, it's about 2.6 to 3 trillion US dollars, and compare that to the great stimulus programs of all time, such as the Hoover Dam, which is only $782 million in today's dollars, the Panama Canal, 14.3 billion, the Marshall Plan, which aided European reconstruction after the Second World War, $150 billion, the New Deal, $500 billion. So China's stimulus package is 6 times larger than that. The only event in history which has been larger was World War II, including the Manhattan Project, or the development of the atomic bomb. So it's important to recognize the China stimulus package is an enormous dynamic. It still has several years to run, and it will still be having positive spillovers to those economies fortunate enough to be beneficiaries of it, which are largely your capital exporters of Asia, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and your commodity exporters of the world, such as Australia and Brazil. The other dynamic to note, and you'll have to excuse the pun, what is driving Asian growth? It's autos and auto production at this stage. Now, if we look at the recovery of Asian production from this cycle, it's been rather unusual. And in this chart on the left, what we've done is just indexed the recoveries from the Asia crisis, the tech wreck, and the current financial crisis, so we can compare the evolution of the recovery. And what has been most notable about this recovery is that it occurred First with industrial production, which recovered within 7 months of the